Bug-Eyed Tales presents Terror in the Alps, Eagle Attack, adapted from a true adventure recounted by Monsieur Antoine Neyssel.
I believe countless tourists to the Riviera will find this tale gripping, perhaps even unsettling. It may forever change the way they gaze upon the majestic mountains that rise above the blue Mediterranean. At the start of the 20th century, the maritime Alps of eastern France, seldom explored by tourists, were unlikely to see a surge in popularity once the chilling dangers revealed in this story come to light. The locals then whispered of climbers who must not only brave avalanches, treacherous snow and loose stones, but also face the terrifying threat of ferocious eagles, hundreds strong, nesting in the perilous crags above. It was early last year when my friend, Monsieur Joseph Monand, and I decided to spend our holidays in the southeast of France. We planned to start with a carefree time in Nice, followed by an ascent of the maritime Alps. On July 1st, we set off from Bordeaux, reaching Nice the following day. Although the Paris of the South was quiet, we enjoyed a fortnight by its beautiful shore before moving on to Menton on the 19th. Here, we intended to leave the sea behind and venture into the mountains. Our journey soon brought us to Sospello, a charming village nestled at the foot of the towering Alps, their peaks glittering with snow. We spent a couple of days in Sospello, searching for reliable guides and gathering useful information. By the evening of July 22nd, everything was in order, guides, axes, and all. We were about to retire early, knowing we'd need to rise at an ungodly hour, when a villager burst into the inn with astonishing news. A man had been savagely attacked and nearly killed by alpine eagles. As we heard this, our guides were preparing to leave for the night. But now the entire village buzzed with the shocking news, every man standing at his door, deep in discussion. I quickly instructed the guides to investigate and report back at once. A man attacked by eagles in the Alps. How extraordinary. A surge of excitement swept through us, and we already felt like daring explorers on the brink of an unforgettable adventure. Presently, our men returned, their faces pale with the tale they had uncovered. The postman, who for years had faithfully carried the mail between Puget-Théniers and Sospello, had been crossing the Alps on his usual route when horror struck. Out of nowhere, a flock of eagles descended upon him with savage fury. He fought desperately, swinging his alpenstock in a frantic attempt to fend off the relentless attack, but the sheer number of birds overwhelmed him. The assault was brutal. He was mercilessly beaten and mutilated, his body ravaged by sharp beaks and tearing talons. It was only by the grace of the dark night and the howling wind that he managed to escape with his life. His back had been shredded, his flesh torn, and his entire body was bruised and battered from the ferocious beating. The sheer violence of the attack left us all shaken, and we couldn't help but imagine the terror he must have felt in those agonizing moments. As the guides continued their shocking tale, undoubtedly embellishing the details, a creeping sense of doubt and fear began to take hold of Monand and me, especially when we realized that we would have to traverse the very same path that the unfortunate postman had taken. What a cheerful prospect! But why remain in doubt when we could speak to the wounded men ourselves? We soon learned that this was indeed possible, so we hurried to the house where he lay. The scene in the quaint little streets was almost surreal. Everyone was abuzz with excitement, chattering away as if the village had never encountered such a sensational event. The postman had been taken into a humble cottage, and the sight that greeted us there is something I will never forget. He hadn't been there long, and the brutality of the attack was evident. Around 30 years old, sturdy and strong, he was not in bed but sprawled unconscious across some chairs, with a ghastly pool of blood collecting beneath him. His clothes were shredded, and it looked as though he had been nearly torn to pieces. His face, in particular, was a horrifying sight. As we stood in the room, he began to regain consciousness, but with it came excruciating pain. We quickly realized there was nothing we could do and left the cottage, deeply shaken and far less enthusiastic about our climb than we had been. By the next morning, however, our perspective had shifted. We reminded ourselves that we had never heard of such an extraordinary event before. Could it really have happened? We also recalled that we had already bought our gear and hired the guides, who would likely demand payment whether they accompanied us or not. Could the postman have fallen into a crevasse? Or had his mind conjured up the entire bizarre attack? In the end, we decided to press on, armed and ready for whatever might come our way. That night, my sleep was plagued by terrifying dreams, undoubtedly stirred by our visit to the tormented postman. We rose before dawn, our minds still clouded by the eerie events of the previous day. Gathering our gear, we stepped into the pre-dawn gloom, meeting our guides in the silent main street. At precisely 5 a.m., we left Sospello behind and set our sights on the towering mountains looming ahead. Our path first led us through a breathtaking valley, shrouded in mist that glistened like silvery vapor under the first rays of sunlight. The landscape was both beautiful and foreboding, with massive fallen crags scattered along our way. The lower hills before us were a patchwork of glassy slopes and imposing rocks, creating a dramatic interplay of light and shadow that seemed to hint at the challenges, and perhaps dangers, lying in wait. I think we had forgotten all about the postman in the sheer joy of living. Higher and higher we climbed steadily, the scent of an alpine morning in our nostrils, and keen with anticipation of unknown pleasures to come. At length we paused for a moment and tied ourselves together with a rope, in the way common to mountaineers in the higher regions. One of the guides then led the way. Mornand and I were in the middle, and our second guide brought up the rear. Both of us carried an ice axe, and we pressed steadily but cautiously higher and higher for another hour or two. By this time we were at a very great height, and I frequently turned to admire the sublime panorama below. Soon, however, we encountered great masses of snow, which rendered our progress quite painfully difficult. Still we climbed upwards until we reached what I may describe as a snowy track, which ran at the very edge of a dizzy cliff. We walked on the very edge because we found it easier to get a foothold there. At last we were about to climb the culminating peak, when suddenly the leading guide pointed abruptly with an exclamation of horror. Looking in the direction indicated, we felt instinctively that we had reached the spot where the ill-fated postman had been attacked by the eagles. There could be no mistake about it, for the terrible battleground was strewn with feathers and drops of blood. It seemed to us miraculous that the man could have escaped from the clutches of the maddened eagles, or that, doing so, he was not hurled into the crevasse on the left. Like a flash, we realized that we had done a silly thing, pushing on here into the lonely wilderness of rocks and snow, not knowing what might happen to us, or whether we would return alive. Presently, however, we remembered that, while the unfortunate postman was alone, there were 4 of us, and each man suitably armed. Nevertheless, I must confess that the idea of being attacked by eagles up in this dizzy place was far from attractive, especially when one looked into the frightful crevasse below. We had passed the spot, however, and were now mounting slowly once more, when suddenly we heard loud, weird screeches, apparently from the very bottom of the abyss on our left. We froze, our breath caught in our throats, hearts pounding with fear and the ominous sense that something terrible was approaching. Then, without warning, the eerie cries echoed again, this time accompanied by the unmistakable, thunderous flapping of enormous wings. Dread tightened its grip on us as we cautiously approached the edge of the crevasse and peered into its shadowy depths. Below, a chaotic swirl of massive, enraged birds battled ferociously, their powerful wings thrashing in a storm of feathers. Strange shrieks and guttural grunts rose from the fray, sending shivers down our spines. Feathers, both large and small, drifted upwards, carried by the frenzy. I had seen eagles fight before, in the safety of zoological gardens, but I had never imagined that I might face death on these mountains, torn apart by the talons and wings of these mighty predators. A chilling realization hit me. They would come for us next. The image of the maimed postman flashed in my mind, a stark reminder of the brutal fate that might await us in the moments to come. Round and round whirled the flocks of giant birds, and horror of horrors, they seemed to be circling up and up towards the top of the crevasse. They're fighting each other now, we muttered in despair, but once they finish, they'll come for us. We had firearms, but what good would they do? Even if we managed to shoot a few, the others could easily overwhelm us, their wings beating us senseless, tossing us into the crevasse before we could even reload. The spot where we stood was treacherous, slick with hard, slippery snow, riddled with hidden crevasses that could swallow us whole. The thought of dying here, not by an avalanche or some tragic accident, but by a horde of vicious birds, was almost too much to bear. Ridiculous ideas flashed through my mind between desperate prayers. In a jungle, pursued by a savage beast, I could fight or flee. Here I could do neither. But then, a sliver of hope. Maybe the eagles wouldn't see us, or maybe they'd be too caught up in their own battle to bother with us. Monand, however, feared the worst. He regretted coming, voicing his dread.
"What a dreadful fate,"
he said.
"to be torn apart by eagles."
He rambled on, his words a mix of fear and frustration, grating on my already frayed nerves. In those tense moments, his words felt both foolish and, given the circumstances, painfully understandable. The whirling, circling mass of battling birds was closing in, nearly at our level now. Panic clawed at us as we turned to the guides, desperately asking what we should do. Was there any way to stop the eagles, which seemed to be multiplying as they rose to meet us? The guides, loyal and steadfast, tried to calm us. They assured us, over and over, that the birds wouldn't harm us. They were too busy tearing at each other. Their words offered a flicker of hope, but fear still gnawed at my gut. I asked if we should fire at them if they came too close. The guide's response was swift and stern. Absolutely not. A single shot, they warned, could bring the entire flock down upon us, turning our thin hope into a death sentence. And so we watched with increasing trepidation as the number of whirling birds grew. More eagles must have joined from their nests in the rock as they ascended. Suddenly, the flapping wings and strange cries grew louder, more menacing. The eagles burst into view, surrounding us, circling with terrifying majesty before diving at each other in fierce combat. By now it must have been 8:30. For more than 20 minutes we had been caught in the midst of this great battle of the birds. When the eagles began to circle us, the guides quietly cut the ropes binding us together. If attacked, they said, each of us needed to fend for ourselves. With hearts pounding, we turned back, moving cautiously where a misstep meant certain death. But where the ground allowed, we raced over the frozen snow like madmen, driven by sheer panic. Looking back, I shudder at the deadly terrain we sped across in our desperate flight. We had only been descending for a few minutes when I heard a loud whirring behind me. I spun around, horror gripping me. The infuriated eagles were closing in. I would be lying if I claimed we felt anything other than pure, abject terror. I was the first to spot them, but fear paralyzed me. I could only stand there, pointing helplessly at the approaching danger. But then, Monand, braver than any of us, raised his gun, ready to confront our aerial assailants head-on. Soon they dashed upon us like an avalanche. I heard a shot. I suppose Monand fired, but I did not. I do not know why. The attack was beyond words, utterly terrifying. The eagles struck with a brutal force, their wings like sledgehammers, their hooked beaks and talons relentless. Instinct took over as I swung wildly with my alpenstock and axe, my gun discarded as useless. It felt as though every inch of my body was under assault at once. It was a savage fight for survival, life or death in its purest form. Strangely, I remember nothing of my companions after the initial onslaught. The eagles' numbers seemed to swell, as if more were joining the fray. My hands were slick with blood, though I felt no pain, only the cold grip of fear. Thoughts raced through my mind like lightning. At one point I dared to hope that if I could just hold out a bit longer, the eagles might retreat. But as I lashed out, the birds only grew more relentless, their screams piercing the air as they swooped in for attack after attack. The strength of their wings was staggering, knocking me around the snow like a rag doll. It's a miracle I wasn't hurled into the crevasse below, sent to my death by the sheer power of their blows. Don't ask me how long the nightmare lasted. It could have been 5 minutes, maybe 15. I have no idea. My strength was draining fast, and I felt the urge to surrender as blood began trickling down my face, nearly blinding me. I knew that any moment could be my last, that I could be thrown into the crevasse. Strangely, the thought didn't terrify me. I fought on, but it was almost mechanical now, with each passing second pulling me closer to the edge of giving up. I didn't think about the guides or poor Monand. If that makes me a coward, so be it. I couldn't help it. Then, out of nowhere, I heard loud, frantic voices. At first I thought they were just a figment of my frenzied mind, but soon I saw men, fierce and determined, laying into the eagles with sticks, driving them off. Most of the birds left me to attack the newcomers, but a few relentless creatures kept circling, striking at me with savage fury. The idea that I might be saved flashed through my mind, and with it, a desperate burst of energy. I dashed downward, leaping and running blindly, desperate to escape the brutal assault. This part I remember clearly, but after that my memory fades. I must have fainted. When I came to, it was mid-afternoon, and with consciousness came unbearable pain. I tried to stand, but my legs gave out beneath me and I collapsed once more. I suddenly thought of Monand and the guides. Where were they? Who were the figures I'd glimpsed on the mountain? As these questions raced through my mind, 2 men appeared behind me, lifting me gently and carrying me down to the village. I asked about Monand, but no one had seen him. The men who rescued me were villagers who had watched our climb through binoculars, a common practice in the Alps. They had seen us stop and wondered what danger we faced. I kept asking about my friend, but no one knew where he was. A dreadful thought crept into my mind. Had Monand been killed by the eagles or hurled into the crevasse? My story is done. It pains me to tell you, however, that 5 days later that poor Monand was found dead at the bottom of the crevasse. His body had been partly devoured by the terrible birds of prey. For myself, I was in bed for 6 weeks, suffering from at least 10 serious wounds in my head and back. The 2 guides escaped and told me that when they last saw Monand, he lay on the ground, on the very edge of the precipice, trying to ward off the birds with his arms. Before I left the peaceful village of Sospello, I learned that the poor postman had succumbed to his injuries as well. And so the eagles of the maritime Alps claimed 2 brave souls. But instead of taking vengeance on nature, we should respect these wild creatures, steer clear of their nesting areas, and remember, when hiking in these mountains, it's best to leave the eagles to their habitat and keep a safe distance. Tourists, beware. The Alps are their home, not ours.
Thank you for listening to this story brought to you by Christina Rotter. We hope this tale of bravery and quick thinking captivated your imagination. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to Bug-Eyed Tales for more unforgettable stories. And don't miss out on our other offerings. Be sure to check out Echoes of the Bayonet, a compelling collection of cartoons and vintage articles that span 2 world wars. It's a treasure trove of history, humor, and insight, capturing the spirit of an era through the eyes of those who lived it. Grab your copy today at Amazon.com and dive into the past with Bug-Eyed Tales.
Nature guards her realm. Winds cut through the mist. Silent peaks hold secrets tight. Survival's thin line. Crafts where eagles soar.